Rutgers football hosting Washington at SHI Stadium on Friday, September 27th, 8 p.m. live on Fox. David Anderson's here to break it all down for us, preview what is a huge opportunity for Rutgers to go 4-0 in September. Washington comes in at 3-1. Rutgers obviously coming in off the 26-23 win at Virginia Tech. Certainly held our breaths at the end, but Rutgers coming out the victors. David, first let's start off with your some quick hits in terms of your thoughts on that victory in Blacksburg last Saturday.
By far and away, number one is you got the win. 5 years from now, we might remember, Virginia Tech fans might remember, but whoever else is doing an opposing podcast and they're looking back at the record, they'll just see that W on the ledger there. Number one. And number two, I think we're going to get into this a lot throughout the preview for Washington, is there are more takeaways you have from a close win than if that would have just been like a punch him in the mouth type of thing. But there were plenty of reasons to feel optimistic and then plenty of reasons to either be pessimistic or at minimum have a level of concern. One thing I do want to say that I think you may have mentioned that we had texted is that Rutgers hasn't played more than like 2.5 quarters of a competitive game since their bowl game against Miami. And so I think that even though the defense wasn't on the field that much, we talked, the time of possession was like 40-20 against Virginia Tech, but they were then even lulled to sleep even more. Like, I don't even know if they had caught their wind. Rutgers was also rotating in a lot of guys. I don't know if that was to offset the fact that, they were tired or potentially tired. I'm not really sure, but that led to some communication breakdowns, similar, ironically, to communication breakdowns I saw from Washington, who luckily benefited from the fact in their game against Northwestern that, Northwestern on the first play, they returned the kick and the guy fell over. Then a guy on the first play from scrimmage tripped on his own 10-yard line again. They had guys running into each other a couple times. And if that would have happened to Virginia Tech, we wouldn't be talking about this in the same way. We'd be talking about it the way Washington was talking about their 24-5 win over Northwestern. So I think there's a lot of ways that this game could have been a blowout for Rutgers. Conversely, there were almost no ways I could see that this would have been a blowout for Virginia Tech, because I just don't think even if they did what they did in the second half and the first half, it would have worked. So I think there's a lot of positives to take away, but sure, there are plenty of negatives. And then the one thing I'll say about coaching, like on the field goal, the 58-yard field goal, or 53-yard field goal ultimately after the offsides, felt like Rutgers was trying to get back, not kicking the field goal in the previous possession because they realized how much making it a 3-score game would be a big difference mathematically. But you can't treat it like that. It just got to be treated as a sunk cost, like you're in business. I do think that was an error. But then you also hit on this a lot in your other podcasts. If you just try to line up and run against them, you're not going to get yardage. Now, in retrospect, they passed the ball a little bit too much. And by not succeeding, you didn't get those body blows in like we saw from the wins they had last year, where body blow, eventually you would wear out your opponent. And so the coaching staff has to go back to the drawing board this week and say, if we're in a close game again, or if we're in a game where we have a lead again, what do we do differently? And I'll talk a little bit more about like some tactical things when we talk about the preview for Washington. But those are just some of my high-level takeaways. And I know a lot of great coverage from a lot of the podcasts, including yourself, as well as some of the other podcasts covered a lot of these things. So I don't need to rehash all of them. But was there another specific thing that you wanted to mention takeaway-wise from the Virginia Tech game?
Well, I think you kind of touched on it, the fact that, being in a close game, I think it can pay dividends down the road, especially now you're going into a game against Washington where, really is pretty even on paper. And Rutgers has, that escapability on the road. And Shiano talking about the looks in their eyes and the huddle and how, they were ready for the moment. There is a certain galvanizing factor in that, I think, that really can benefit this team. We saw them be able to do that at times last year. But I think to get tested so early on after 2 games where, really wasn't close and they weren't challenged, to have to do that in their third game, I think can benefit now when they go into 4 games that on paper, they're all winnable. Doesn't mean, I mean, they could lose all of them too, but there's certainly this 4-game stretch is an opportunity to extend that ceiling for the season where you could really have something special here. So I think it could really benefit them to have gone through that the way they did. As you said, certainly some self-inflicted wounds there, but also I think just in terms of how they were, I think the most encouraging thing is when the game was tied, all 3 units came through. You had
Right.
the offense with the
Exactly.
screen pass, which, God bless Kirk Shiraka for actually calling the screen pass. Seeing Ian Strong, a guy we've talked about that really needed to step up, he did.
He
Uh,
did.
and and then in terms of special teams, I mean, Patel was only a 25-yarder, but still that was big for him to come back after missing 2. And then the fact that Longerbeam took matters into his own hands and got that. You need your best players to make big plays and big moments, and they did that. And then Monungai really icing the clock, with the run game at the end when he didn't have his best game, but he still was able to do what he needed to do to get Rutgers the win. So many different components. It's just like they went into another gear. It was automatic in a way where just boom, okay, we're gonna make a play here, we're gonna make a play here, we're gonna make a play here, and until you have that test, it gives them confidence now, but also it's just like a reflex that that's what winning teams do, right? They know how to turn it on when it matters most, and they did that. So huge positive there.
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of things we talked about how, both on offense and defense, Rutgers was setting up Virginia Tech, and they had more in the bag if they had to go back to it. And even that longer beam blitz, okay, Rutgers had an almost identical play, but from the other side on what ultimately was the big play that set up the, I guess, second Virginia Tech touchdown, where Rutgers brought a either corner or safety blitz, and then Jelani, it was actually a zone blitz, and Walker ended up in coverage. And I mean, he basically was covering the guy who ultimately made the catch in a huge play. And that's not really what you want. An inexperienced defensive end. Yes, he has experience playing tight end, but having him drop off into coverage. So Drones, as soon as he saw that corner pressure, he may have been expecting, zone blitz or nobody, right? Because quarterbacks are taught if where you see the blitz coming from is usually where you can fit that ball in if you properly had a pre-snap read, because you know that there's not just 2 guys standing there. So as soon as he saw the pressure, he did the right thing. But one thing I talked about in the preview was how on his throwing to his left, he had less like arm angles and kind of ways he throw the ball. So he just kind of threw a normal route, and Robert Longerbeam didn't have to adjust for a changeup or a loft pass or anything, and he just jumped up and batted it. So I think that was a little bit of a coaching thing as well for Rutgers defense, where they did set up the Virginia Tech offense to make that mistake. Also, credit earlier on that drive, it was 3rd and 5, when a lot of times in those situations, like you're giving up a lot of first downs on either first or second down and letting them move the chains. Virginia Tech was forced into making a tough play there because they had to get the conversion. And so a nice play earlier in the drive by, I guess it was Jabomi, but Powell was kind of in the area, and I think Longerbeam as well on the previous play on 2nd and 10 was huge as well. So, I think a lot of those things go unnoticed. When you think back emotionally, like, I have to admit, I'm glad I didn't podcast because I was so emotional in that 4th quarter as I was like listening to this. It was rough. So I just think that, and then on offense, we talked about it, setting him up with that cross screen action so that on the option, and then ultimately it failed on that 4th and goal. We could talk more about that in a second, but then they were perfectly primed for that Ian Strong screen pass. And I still don't know how Virginia Tech didn't get more pressure on Kelly McManus up the middle, because it seemed like they just didn't even block 2 guys to allow, I guess it was Zelinskis and Asamoah to get out there. But I mean, just overall a great job of having more in the bag. And I'm just happy Rutgers got a win, because at the end of the season, we're going to just be talking about this as either what launched them to success or was the first chink in the armor.
True. Very true. I think another thing that we take for granted, that credit to Sons of Saturday podcast, Pat Fenn, great guy there, in terms of what they harped on the difference between Rutgers and Virginia Tech was just how involved Rutgers is in the game as a team. their
Yes.
enthusiasm, the sideline, how when they make a big play, multiple teammates are there to celebrate, and just how there was no energy on the Virginia Tech sideline, and that Rutgers, and it's fair to criticize Shiano. I did it. We all did it in terms of some of the decision making, but we really do take for granted, I think, in terms of how connected the program is from a culture standpoint, from a leadership standpoint, where players are, they embrace leading one another, and it's sticky, right? Keep chopping and family spelled out and all that stuff. But that's where it shows up in games like that, where it can overcome mistakes that happen on the field because you're such a connected team that believes in one another. And I think you saw that manifest itself. So I think huge credit to just that. That's what Greg Schiano does best, I think. And I think you can criticize his X's and O's, but this team can overcome adversity, self-inflicted sometimes. But I think that was a key difference that podcast, credit to them, pointed out. That I think, again, as Rutgers fans, we're so locked in certain things. But it really is true. We're just accustomed to seeing this team so emotionally charged and invested that it's something you can't take for granted.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of good takeaways just from listening to the Virginia Tech podcast. And again, it's a great team to play against, kind of like we talked about with Michigan State last year. There's no shortage of coverage. And then Washington is kind of similar because they've a historically great program. They've even got a Locked On Washington Huskies podcast where they have a podcast every day. You're the only Rutgers daily podcast, but so just always getting good content there and just hearing their perspectives. And so, yeah, they say everyone's kind of getting this thing that the chop is a little bit cliche or shtickish. I think there's, like you said, the word they used, but that the players actually believed in it. And even when they were down, or not down, but once the game was tied, they didn't quit. And Shiano even mentioned this in his press conference that he saw the eyes in the huddle. And so, like we talked about with the Michigan State game last year, I think that set them up better to win potentially Indiana if it was closer, and then ultimately in the bowl game many weeks, months later, because the team had been through that. I mean, how many close games have they won in the last 2-3 years? 2-3, maybe. You could say maybe that Indiana game where Braswell had the pick six to ice it, fairly close. The Illinois game a couple of years ago. So this team needs some close wins. And also, like we talked about with Michigan State last year, it's not a signature win on the outside of the program. But inside the program, it does go a long way to say you can do it, like don't quit, never quit type of thing. And so I am pleased about that. And I think as we start to transition into this matchup with the Washington Huskies, I do think they're going to be riding a little bit of a hangover from their win last week against Northwestern. Like I said, I think that the Northwestern Wildcats were making a lot of self-inflicted wounds, dropping passes, falling down, missed assignments that may make Washington a little bit more, pleased with their own performance than they potentially could have been. And no matter what the coaches do, I mean, these are 18 to 22, 23, at like these days, 24 sometimes year old guys, but they're young kids. And so no matter what your coaches say, like they're going to come into this game overconfident. Hopefully Rutgers will not come into this game overconfident because they saw how tough last week was.
Well, and I think that's key. I think they won't, right? And it's nothing better than getting a win, but having the attention of your team. And obviously there's things that need to be corrected. So I think, and also the leadership of this team, the veterans on this team, it's obviously, it was going to be an emotional turnaround, win or lose.
Right.
But you're the team that's coming home. You're the team that's going to have a packed house, a blackout, and Washington is a team that, had a comfortable win and has to travel 3,000 miles now on short rest. So, I do think that will show up in some way. It doesn't mean that that's going to be the difference, but certainly an advantage for Rutgers there. But overall, in terms of how these teams match up, what kind of jumps out at you initially in terms of these two teams on paper and how they'll look going head-to-head on the field?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably easiest for our listeners to take this in just side by side, like who's got the advantage at quarterback. Sometimes you'd see this like in basketball because the guys are actually guarding each other, both sides of the ball. So it's a little different in football. But, when you look at the quarterbacks, very similar quarterbacks. I mean, Will Rogers, over 100 career touchdowns, less than 30 career interceptions. So obviously his stats are a lot better than Nathan Kaliakmanis, but his style of play is very similar. He likes to drop back in the pocket. If he's got a guy open with a few steps on his defender, he's going to hit him in stride and get big yards. He's also capable, let's say it's 1st and 10 and nothing's open. He's capable of tucking the ball and running, not that fast, not that far, but setting up a 2nd and 6, 2nd and 5, because of his ability to just, tuck it and run. I think it was Mike Broadbent had mentioned, imagine if Gavin Wimsatt had just did that last year. First of all, he would be running for more than 5 yards because he's a really good runner. But the amount of times Rutgers would have been in more favorable situations, it would have been a night and day difference from where we were. And Rodgers and Kaliakmanis both do that. The other thing about Rodgers, this is something that Bill Belichick, ironically, father of Washington Huskies defensive coordinator Steve Belichick, said one time about the San Francisco 49ers and Joe Montana. If you play zone, they'll complete every pass. And I do feel that if Rutgers plays too much zone or a lot of zone, that Will Rogers might complete almost every pass. I mean, he's already completing high 70s percentage. He's near the tops in the nation. I think I have in here that he's second in the Big Ten in yards and touchdowns, and not surprising. Like, if a guy's open, he's got the accuracy, see him and hit him. The one thing I will say about Kaliakmanis compared to Rodgers is that he is more willing to trust his eyes and his play call, which sometimes means he's throwing the ball into a little bit of a tighter window. But Kaliakmanis does trust that a guy will break open, whereas a lot of times Rodgers, having come from an air raid system, he wants his guy to be wide open. He wants his guy to be wide open, which means if you're in coverage, sometimes if you just are close or giving the illusion that you're in a good covered position, he might not throw the ball and elect to tuck it and run or do a check down. So there are advantages, even though, yes, from a talent perspective, from a stats perspective, I do think Will Rogers is one of the toughest quarterbacks we'll ever face. I mean, how many times will Rutgers ever face such quarterback ever again who's thrown for over 100 touchdowns in his career? So he's got the weapons. So we'll talk about that in a second. But from your quarterback perspective, you got to give Washington a little bit of an edge, though in a close game, that edge might be kind of shrunk a little bit with good defensive play.
Yeah, and just on Rodgers, he's completed 75.7% of his passes. It's not like it's an anomaly. 2 years ago when he had 610 pass attempts for Mississippi State, he completed 68% of his passes. The year before, 683 attempts, 73.9% completion percentage. So he's insanely accurate. As you mentioned, doesn't throw a lot of picks. He's got 8 touchdowns, 0 interceptions through 4 games so far. Arguably, I think the best quarterback Rutgers will face this year. You could argue from a talent standpoint, Dylan Raiola next week at Nebraska is more talented. And there's some other good quarterbacks in the conference, but I think that this is certainly how they defend Rodgers, how they generate pressure on him. It's obviously going to be a huge factor in this game.
For sure. And I mean, one thing that they do well is they have a couple receivers. Our old friend Giles Jackson, when I say old friend, because he had a big catch for Michigan against Rutgers in the 2020 game. He left Michigan, transferred to Washington. He's kind of their guy that you'll see lined up all over the formation. They also have Boston, who I think you already mentioned. Huge game last week. I think 7 catches. Mm-hmm. I think he had 2 or 3 touchdowns, 121 yards. He's more of a complete receiver who can run basically any route in the tree. I mean, that's another thing that scares you a little bit is when Rodgers is in the game, then pretty much every route, every throw is on the table. And you'll hear that. I mean, I know sometimes the term's overused. Like you would hear, Mark Sanchez can make every throw or something like that. And I mean, Will Rogers is a better thrower than Mark Sanchez, just for the record. But it makes you as a defense have to defend everything. They do have a backup quarterback. I think it's Damon Williams, who they will insert in the game periodically, sometimes a little bit randomly. And that's one theme for this Washington Huskies team. Sometimes they can outsmart themselves from a coaching standpoint, much like we saw Rutgers last week. And so Williams will get a drive here and there. And he's your typical running quarterback in a sense that sometimes it's one read. Usually that one read is first play he comes in the game, typically. They'll run a slant route. He'll throw a slant. And if the guy's open, great. Then the slant will set up a curl route. And then If that's not there, he'll just tuck in and run, and usually against a fairly empty box because they'll go 5 wide. And so this is something you need to be ready for Rutgers. Obviously, they faced 3 mobile quarterbacks already, but the fact that Washington State has complete polar opposites in terms of their quarterback room can present challenges for the defense. So don't be surprised even if Will Rogers is, playing quite well, that they still put Williams in the game. Hopefully Rutgers can use that as an opportunity to kind of jump on them and get Washington a little bit out of sorts. But don't lose track of him. And then obviously the running back, Kyle Monangai is, I believe, first or second in the conference in rushing, but Coleman is 4th, and he runs a lot like a Ray Rice. He's basically a bowling ball where it's really hard. Like if you hit him up high, he's not going to go down at all. But his legs are so thick. He's maybe 5'9" on a good day, and he's averaging almost 7 yards a rush, which again, not an anomaly. At Arizona last year, he averaged about 7 yards per carry as well. So he's the type of guy that's tough to bring down, but he's, again, very short, and he has very good lateral acceleration. Again, when you watch him, you'll see some Ray Rice in his game. I don't think he has the vision of a Rice or even a Monangai. I would say that, Monangai, we get used to the fact that he had a, quote, bad game and he rushed for 84 yards. I mean, that's pretty impressive, right? And Coleman doesn't tote the rock the same. Even Bashal Tutin was more of the emotional heartbeat of the Virginia Tech Hokies. Coleman's not their emotional heartbeat, but he's that guy that you'll see come in, like even in the NFL level, and just bowling ball you over for a few yards or surprise you with his quickness. And so he is a threat. And again, I could give Rutgers a slight edge at running back, maybe, just like I would give Washington the edge at quarterback, but it's not as big of a gap as you would think. So just, quarterback and running back alone, like this is kind of a push so far.
Yeah, and with Coleman, he's only averaging 14 carries a game. So they do, right. It's not a true platoon, but Cameron Davis, has he's averaging 5 yards a carry. He's averaging 6 carries a game, and then a couple others sprinkled in there. But just in terms of, one thing that a lot of Washington fans are boasting is they really feel like Washington is, in terms of their size, their speed, that they think they're going to blow Rutgers away. Just, on paper, in terms of how the lines match up, in terms of the playmakers and receiver, what are your thoughts in terms of how they match up in terms of those regards, size and speed, from a Washington offense to a Rutgers defense perspective?
Well, I mean, you mentioned Davis, the running back. He did have 13 touchdowns 2 years ago. He's a big back. He's basically your Sam Brown type, but he's even more of a between the tackles, like, power guy. What I would say about that is, much like Rutgers on offense, they have a good mix of size and speed and the skill positions. And so, but also like Rutgers, they don't throw to as many receivers typically. I mean, we saw last week, Rutgers only had 3 guys to catch, if I'm remembering right. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of similar in that sense, but they do bring a variety of skill sets. And I do think their offensive line is quite similar to Rutgers. As I was mentioning to you offline, Rutgers fans are pretty upset about that sequence where Rutgers passed the ball twice when they were up by 2 scores. I was like first and second down. Washington had an almost identical situation when they were up big last week, where they took a sack on first and second down. And the reason on one play was because they didn't properly pick up a guy, much like that play where Konopka and Pierce clearly weren't on the same page. Or I guess it was Brown blocking from the backfield. But Washington just had a communication breakdown. And then they had another play where one of their interior linemen just got blown up by the guy he was supposed to block, much like Rutgers had. And so I do think that the line play is going to be very similar. Like, Rutgers may struggle later in the season with the fact that one of the reasons, like we saw, they would not want to go with Zelinskis or Felter or earlier in their careers is they felt like they might be overpowered by a big guy. And Washington has kind of similar things, especially because the Washington defensive tackles are all huge. They're all 300 pounds. And so we saw how Rutgers struggled to defend Fuga from Virginia Tech last week, the big guy. I mean, Washington has 4 guys that are about 300 pounds that rotated defensive tackle. Valdez is particularly good. He's got 16 tackles in the year. And then they also have this other guy, Sagapolu. I might be saying his name wrong, but he's 368-pound defensive tackle. And so Washington will have the defensive tackles to exploit Rutgers' weakness in the interior of the line. The question is, can the Rutgers defensive tackles be equally effective against the Washington offensive line, who is equally limited at times in terms of their ability to block these like bigger, more powerful interior defenders?
Great points. Obviously, it's early, only 3 games to Rutgers, 4 games to Washington, but just looking at some stat comparisons, Washington has the much better pass offense. Rutgers has a much better rushing offense, run attack. But in terms of defense, right now, in terms of both teams are really strong against the run. In terms of, Washington's actually better in terms of their what they've allowed in the run game. They're 38th nationally. Rutgers has actually struggled with that. They gave up over, I think, 6 yards a carry to Virginia Tech. Obviously, Teuton's very good. But in terms of that, that's interesting. And then also total defense right now. I mean, Washington's 11th nationally. Rutgers is 34th. Total offense, Rutgers is 20th. Washington is 31st. So that's something to watch for in terms of that. But yes, I think, Rutgers has to be able to generate. I mean, time of possession's been everything. They're averaging 35 minutes a game. Can they do what they want to do in the run game early? And then I guess transitioning to that thought, a little bit all over the place, but wanted to ask you in the moment, Monangai, Sam Brown, Nishano, about their distribution in terms of carries. It was about 65-35 in that game. And talking about how Monangai's always dealing with stuff. I guess offensively, how do you see the Rutgers approach against this Washington defense?
Well, it's a really good question because a lot depends on how Washington is going to play defense. One of the things that's great about watching their defense, again, Steve Belichick, Washington defensive coordinator, played at Rutgers, was mainly a lacrosse player, but he was also on the football team in that 2011 season. And so his defense looks a lot like a Shiano defense, but also a lot like his father, a Bill Belichick defense. And so the main thing to take away that I would say he gets from his father is Bill Belichick would never risk just being gouged by the run up the middle. So he will always make sure that he has defensive linemen that can stop the run in the middle of the field. The other thing that he gets from his father is and this is kind of a Shiano thing too, where you start to see the overlap. Because you have such big guys in the middle of the front, it allows you to sacrifice that with maybe some smaller, faster guys elsewhere in your defense. And so it's not that they're not in a position where every one of their guys, like they were in their team last year, which almost won a national title, was big and fast. So when sometimes they have to sacrifice speed for size with the group that they have now. Now, mind you, Washington on their roster, despite all the turnover from last year, they still have 22 four-star players. 4 stars, 22. Rutgers, by comparison, has 7 or 8, depending on the source you're looking at. And so there is talent there, but especially on defense, you'll see some guys who aren't your prototypical linebacker, safety. Maybe they're a little short, maybe they're a little thin for their position, but in aggregate, they have the size. So one of the things that I'm curious to see if they do, first of all, Washington, again, can overcoach themselves defensively because they rotate too many guys. So sometimes there's communication breakdowns, exactly the same as we saw from Rutgers against Virginia Tech in the secondary last week. So sometimes there's breakdowns for that. And then also the inexperience, like they don't always know exactly what angles or when they're passing off a receiver or what their zone depth should be. So there's some ways that you can attack that. I'm curious if they're going to do what Virginia Tech did, which is like basically funnel. I mean, basically what Virginia Tech was doing was they were not just stacking the exact middle, but they were forcing Rutgers running backs to go straight ahead and preventing them from getting that bounce outside. So on, I believe it was a second touchdown drive, Sam Brown had a couple carries where he kind of ran it and 2 guys were there and they didn't run full speed to just take him down because they didn't want to risk that he was going to juke them. But instead, they got a hand on him, and then Brown kind of carried them for a couple of yards and fell forward, including on the touchdown. And so I'm curious because Washington doesn't have – I mean, they have 2 good linebackers, Bruner and Tuputala, both captains, experienced guys who basically were role players last year, and now they're like the cornerstones of their defense. But they're not overly powerful and big. I've got their weights listed here. Bruner's only 220, and Tuputala is only 230, maybe. He looks lighter than that. And so Rutgers is going to have to fight for those yards vertically in the middle. That's where Brown has a little bit of an edge over Monangai because that's just not really Monangai's game. I mean, I think that Washington's probably going to take a page out of the Virginia Tech book and say, hey, we'll rather give up a potentially 5-yard run that may turn into 7 if you fall forward than give up you bouncing outside for 25, 30 yards. So, and like Virginia Tech, they have probably more talent defensively, but they have even less experience. So when you get out in space and you can get them out in space defending space, that's where they're potentially at risk. And that's where they lost their one game of the season. Yes, their run defense is good, but they gave up a few runs to the perimeter against Washington State that ended up being the difference in the game just because of lack of discipline and angles. So Washington has everything available to them defensively. They got big guys, they got fast guys, they got blitzes, they got stay-at-home tactics. Everything's in the playbook, and I really don't know what they're going to deploy. I would think they might try to lean into what worked for Virginia Tech in the second half of last week's game.
Yeah, those are really good points. And just in terms of, let's talk about Rutgers in the passing attack. Ethan Kaliakmanis obviously really had an important performance at Virginia Tech. You could argue that, if it to last year with Wimsatt, Rutgers would not won that game on Saturday without the way Kaliakmanis performed. Super efficient again in the short and intermediate passing attack. And then 3 established targets where, and Shiraka really went to what was working in terms of the rollout on play action. Kenny Fletcher having 7 catches, most for a tight end since Tyler Croft over a decade ago. And then obviously Ian Strong stepping up. But then, of course, Demir Miller, the weapon that we all thought he could be. It feels like those 3 guys are establishing themselves as consistent, reliable playmakers in the pass game, and that Kaliakmanis has established a bit of a rhythm here in terms of what works in the short and intermediate passing attack. What are your thoughts on that in terms of how they've looked so far and how they might attack Washington through the air?
Yeah, the one thing that surprised me was how much Miller might have actually been playing outside rather than the slot because he was having success in both. Rutgers needs to find a deep threat. I mean, they gotta come up with a way to force teams to guard them deep because Washington, they like to play a lot of cover 2. Sometimes they are susceptible to covering air, but if they take the Virginia Tech approach and just kind of stack more people horizontally, that's going to make it so that Rutgers is going to have to beat teams over the top, or they're going to have to hit a fast receiver that breaks through the line, kind of like we saw Christian Dremel do against Michigan last year. And so I'm hopeful that, either Dremel maybe getting a few more reps or somebody can at least force them to have to defend more of the field. From a receiver standpoint, again, we talked about how Rutgers only had 3 guys that made catches. They're going to have to get more out of other guys. I know Ben Black drew a key pass interference, which seemed a little soft, but I think he might be a guy, or Dremel kind of passing through to the second and third levels to at least force the defense to, defend him back there. Washington does miss a lot of tackles. They also commit a lot of penalties. So you got to kind of force them to make plays to beat you. And then the one thing that's also a huge wild card in here, like I said, sometimes they do too much. And when you do too much, you don't do anything particularly well. And so I'm hesitant to say that Rutgers should not let them sub, because I do think that they're going to try, anytime it's third down, they're going to try to get some of these bigger guys off the field and go with more speed. So forcing them to stay on the field may make sense. But then we also, like I mentioned, they have a lot of other guys in the secondary, and they may be more prone to communication breakdowns if they're doing a lot of subbing in and out. So I do think Rutgers may try to not let them sub. And we saw a situation last week, super weird play, where Rutgers started to sub 19 seconds on the play clock. My understanding is that the defense has 3 seconds to decide to sub, which would have got it down to 16 seconds. But then they are supposed to have subbed within 10 seconds, which means Rutgers should have at least had 6 seconds on the play clock. But the referees never let Rutgers start the play, and so they ended up having to burn a timeout during, I think it was the drive right before Virginia Tech tied it up. And so that was a huge momentum shift there, because it gave Virginia Tech's defense time to get it together. after surrendering a first down or two. And so I think that their pass defense is kind of boom or bust. I think they can commit a lot of penalties, but they're fast. And so Rutgers is going to have to get contributions from someone other than Strong and Miller. I don't know. Is it Dremel? Is it Black? Somebody has to step up other than just Fletcher, Strong, and Miller, who, did a great job last week. I don't know what routes you want to attack Washington because they run all kinds of coverages. They do attend at times get caught with covering air and covering nobody. So there are ways you can exploit them. And if I said anything more than that, I'm sure Greg Schiano would make sure this podcast was shut down.
I feel like Shiraka, you're seeing him start to cook a little bit in terms of feeling out his options and getting into a rhythm. I thought, there's certain drives in that Virginia Tech game, although some people question some of the play calls. He really kept Virginia Tech off balance. And you talked about at the end of the game how they kind of set them up for what they were able to do at the end. I feel like that's a strength of his as a coordinator when he has weapons at his disposal. So I'm really excited to see what he can now do in game 4 against a team that you talked about can be a little bit over opportunistic. Does have that speed, but can also miss in ways from a coverage standpoint. Also, in terms of how he will try to set Washington up defensively, it's going to be a true chess match. And Steve Belichick, obviously, a ton of NFL experience as well with the Patriots. So it's going to be a fascinating matchup. And I think the greater point, that I wanted to make that I think you agree with is that, on paper, I think there's a little bit of a false confidence that people just thought, well, Washington, they disbanded their team from last year. And this is a game that Rutgers should be absolutely winning at home. Where, I talked about in our season preview, for me, this is the most important game. Now 3-0, to be able to go 4-0 in September and go into that stretch of October is just such a tremendous opportunity. But by no means is this an easy game. Obviously, momentum is going to be key. 1 point to note, third down. Rutgers has been much more efficient on third down, 53% this year than Washington. So that could be a key differentiator in this game. But overall, just your thoughts on this matchup in terms of how close it is and what you think could be the difference in this game.
I would say if this is a neutral field, Washington should be favored. Mm-hmm. And I say that just because they just have a higher ceiling as a team. I think that, like we talked about preseason, Rutgers has been lucky in terms of getting teams at the right time. Virginia Tech's going to be better later in the year. I'm sure of it. Nebraska, maybe they're vulnerable at the moment. They might be better later in the year. So they might get them at the right time. Wisconsin's without their starting quarterback, and they still haven't had time to adjust. We saw how terrible they were without their starter last year. So I think that this game is coming at a good time because Washington has so many contributors that even if they're hit with injuries at any position other than quarterback, maybe wide receiver, that they're going to be a better team at the end of the year. And so this is a good time when they're still trying to figure out their identity, especially on defense, that you might be able to take advantage of them. The other thing I'll say in terms of differentiator, special teams, there are some areas where Washington, I think they have the worst kickoff coverage, maybe worst coverage overall in the kicking game of any team in the country. It's too bad Rutgers returns less kicks than probably any team in the country. That's not an area where Rutgers is unless you have the Aaron Kirkshank. I don't think Greg Schiano wants to return a kick. So someone made that a point on one of the other podcasts, to their credit.
Just to your point, kick return defense, Washington is 128th.
Okay, so close to last in the country. But they have a really good kicker. And I do think Jay Patel I'll give it Washington the edge of kicker for sure. But, I mean, I'm not going to blame the 53-yarder on Patel. I just don't think he has that big of a leg. It's a long kick. It was a bizarre situation where he was out there 3 times. And even though when he pushed from close, one of the toughest kicks as a kicker to make, speaking from minor experience here, is that right side hash mark where you're so close. Like, he almost might have been better to kick that from 5 yards back because just the angle is kind of weird. Like, you practice from the right hash, but it's not that comfortable of a kick to make. I mean, even if you played soccer, picture trying to kick straight into the middle of the goal, not to the corner, if you are kicking from like the side of the 18-yard box, like especially on the right side, it's just not a naturally comfortable kick to make. You're a lot more comfortable either in the middle or kicking from the left hash. So as soon as they lined up for that kick, I was like, he's going to miss it. And I knew he was going to miss it right away, the way that they lined up, and I just saw his angle, and I was sad I was wrong, but I was sad to be right, I should say. But, I mean, I think Washington has a slight edge of kicker. Their punter, his punting average is not that much lower than Jacob Anderson, but it is many positions lower. I mean, there's a lot of guys with roughly the same punting average. Anderson, though, did outkick his coverage on that one that set up the second Virginia Tech touchdown. If you want to talk about biggest momentum play in that game, it was that punt because Lane returned it and flipped the field entirely, and then Virginia Tech scored in like basically 2 plays. And so he did outkick the coverage a little bit. I do think the coverage was not great. I know Abram Wright missed a tackle, and then 2 other guys ran into each other. Beyond that, that's set for even more yardage. But he did outkick the coverage to his detriment. But in the special teams area overall, other than the place kicker, Rutgers is better. And like we talked about with Michigan State last year, they might need to win the game in special teams. They won that game in special teams. So last week, not the best special teams performance for Rutgers, but that might be an area where, much like Virginia Tech, Washington's kind of boom or bust in special teams. Rutgers needs to be steady in this game. That's definitely another X factor.
Well, and I mentioned in my big picture takeaways earlier this week, I feel like on short rest in particular, special teams is one of those where, from a mental focus standpoint, I feel like special teams is even more of an important factor in the game because, on short rest, errors can happen more likely. And right. I think Rutgers, like you said, if they could just be steady. And I kind of do feel like they had the moment last week with Nasir Montgomery and forcing that fumble. That was huge. But they're kind of due a block. And I think I agree with you on Patel. I think it's kind of a blip. I think he just had a bad day. I do think that miss initially is kind of an underrated point where it kind of did force the staff into some bad decisions. Not that they were forced to make the bad decisions, but if he had made that initially, it does change the game's dynamics, I think, in terms of what decisions would have been after that point. So that was a huge miss in the game. But I still think, in a way, I like that Schiano did have him kick the 53-yarder because he can say to him, listen, I still believe in you. I have confidence in you. And it did ultimately pay off in that 25-yarder. So I think he is a fresh slate going into this game. But I agree with you. I think special teams is a huge X factor in this game. Overall, any closing thoughts on this matchup? Rutgers-Washington, Friday night, 8 p.m. Fox at SHI Stadium.
I would say it's the reverse of Virginia Tech in a sense that I can see more ways that Washington could come up with a big win in this one. Whereas last week, there was a lot of ways that Rutgers could win. There's really only one way Virginia Tech was going to win, and that was to just beat them with speed. And whereas Washington is the faster team in this game, they've got more contributors on defense. But I think that, they played one 4-quarter game all year and they lost. I do think that in a tight game, you got to go with what you do well. And I think Rutgers is a little bit more in tune with what that is at this point in time. And so if the game can stay close, I feel good for Rutgers. But the other thing I'll say is if you want to talk about things, is like Will Rogers isn't going to throw 4 picks. He's not going to be terrible. Ethan Kaliakmanis, he played great last week. He's been good so far this year. But if Ethan Kaliakmanis has one of the games that got him, the ire of the Minnesota fan base, Rutgers can't win. They cannot win this game if he plays poorly. And so he doesn't have to play amazing. I don't think he needs to have his best game to win. I don't even think he needs to play as well as he did last week. But he cannot blow the game for them. I feel like Rutgers has a lot more pressure on them to not lose the game on special teams, not lose the game at quarterback, not lose the game because of, giving up a couple bombs to their receivers who are better on deep balls. So I think the crowd is really important on this one. It's Washington's first road game of the year. They played a neutral site that was 11 miles from their home stadium. So overall, preseason, I picked Rutgers to win because I had no idea what to expect from this Washington team. On paper, very similar teams. across the board, slight edge to either team pretty much in every area. There's no area where one team is way better or way worse than the other. So hopefully the home crowd gives you that 3.5 point boost that bettors look at, right? That, and then hopefully Rutgers just does what they do best, better, and they can come out with the victory. But this to me is about as 50-50 as you get.
Yeah, excellent points. And I think this is a classic example of what you and I have talked about for a year now in terms of the Pac-12 teams coming in with more pass-first offenses, having explosiveness in the pass game, something Rutgers really hasn't had to deal too much of with in the Big Ten, other than Maryland, which has not gone well for obvious reasons in recent years. So even though Will Rogers, does kind of pick his spots and isn't a gunslinger per se, I agree with you that, their ability to defend the pass in this game is critical, not allow big pass plays, where momentum can switch pretty quickly. I do, we've talked about Rutgers' ability to come back. Callie McManus has shown that he can come through at times. So I think they do have more of an ability to come back, but you still don't want to be in that situation, especially at home on short rest. You need to avoid mistakes. I thought it was encouraging. Virginia Tech made 2 big mistakes in the first quarter, and Rutgers pounced on it and took advantage. That's obviously a sign of a good team. So I think how the first quarter, is it a feeling out process? Does anyone blink early and make a critical mistake? Obviously, Rutgers needs to avoid that. But I think the defense, this is a big statement game for the Rutgers defense. Can they actually be better than last year? They have everybody back, or hopefully they will. They did against Virginia Tech, other than Motoray. Can they get a little more momentum now with guys a week better, a week healthier, a week under their belt as a total defense in this season? I think, looking for that progress there and the kind of game that Harry Simak calls and how they're able to kind of scheme against a pretty dangerous Washington team. David Anderson, as always, thank you so much for everything. Appreciate everyone listening and watching. And we'll be back after the game with plenty of reaction, rapid reaction. We'll have David back early in the week to recap the game as well. And hopefully we're talking about a 4-0 September heading into a critical October where the ceiling could continue to go up. Thanks so much again, and we'll talk to you soon.